All right, everyone, I will be talking to you about grief in the age of artificial intelligence from a neuropsychological perspective to ethical horizons. This presentation is going to have like two parts. Initially, we're going to talk about the neuroscience of grief and the empirical based treatments. And the second part, we're going to go over AI's invasion in mental health, especially grief and its ethical concerns. But to understand grief, we need to understand how we attach to one another. And scientists actually look at the behavior of these little guys called prairie voles, and and the reason why they pick those mammals is because they form monogamous pair bonding, kind of like similar to humans. So what they did was like they waited for them to mate, and after mating, they create a very strong bond to a specific prairie vole. And what they observe is once they separated those prairie voles, they observed that cortisol levels actually increase and the oxytocin levels decrease. And they waited for a little bit and they bring those prairie voles back again to their specific mate. And they observe the opposite effect. The oxytocin levels increase and the cortisol levels decrease. Also, they took a look on the nucleus accumbens of these little creatures and they observed the role of the dopamine because the dopamine was released. So they got really happy about being together with their mate. But I want to just bring you like a brain scan so you have an idea what's happening in their brains. As you can see here, there is montane voles and prairie voles, and you see like a bunch of black dots in the cortex. These are oxytocin receptors. So we can say here, like basically prairie voles, they become attached to a specific prairie vole because in their brain, there is like there is a physical representation of their mate in their cortex, which actually explains why they have so many receptors for oxytocin. But if we take this principle applied to the case of prairie voles, we can apply that to humans as well. We do as well have this ability to have physical representations on our cortex of our loved ones. But there is one particular thing. We don't have that same stress response like prairie voles when we are apart from people because our brains have this capacity to predict where our loved ones are at any time and moment, and we even get excited just to think about them, releasing oxytocin and dopamine. But death actually breaks this cycle of a prediction because once that happens, your brain has to go through another process of learning, and which basically is learning to attached to your love figure, but not in the physical way. That's why Mary Frances O'Connor says here, grief can be considered a form of learning, requiring time and feedback in the form of real world experience. But I'm gonna just go over like some brain areas that actually active during grief. So it's starting with the amygdala. Obviously, it makes so much sense because it's the area of the brain responsible for emotional response, and obviously you create emotional bonding with the person you love. The prefrontal cortex in this particular case is underactive, which obviously that explains why it's so hard to control emotions because the prefrontal cortex control emotions. The hippocampus is underactive. That's why it's hard to form and retain your information during this time. The nucleus accumbens here is very interesting because in particular grief, prolonged grief disorder, this area is actually highly active. The same thing we saw in the prairie voles that makes them connect to one another. Here is basically in the prolonged grief disorder, this area is highly active, which explains the yearning. We're going to go over like when I talk about the DSM-5. The anterior cingulate cortex is underactive in prolonged grief disorder. This area is actually responsible for pain and pain response, emotional and physical. But in prolonged grief disorder, this area is actually underactive, which explains why they don't, their refusal to accept like grief. And posterior cingulate cortex makes so much sense in both cases because that area is responsible for autobiographic memory. But looking at networks, not just the brain, but look like networks in the brain, we can look at the HPA axis, which is responsible for your stress response. And what the scientists observe is like in normal grief, there is an uptick of cortisol levels that eventually over time goes back to homeostasis. But in prolonged grief disorder, that stress response continues to maintain over time. And also just a quick note here, like that text that we had in class talking about like how people presented difficulty to go to sleep during grief is may be explained because of the cortisol levels. But looking at the DSM-5 here, every single one of those symptoms that you see here on the DSM-5 can be correlated to the neurobiological factors that we just talked about. Intense yearning and longing for the deceased person here is connected to the nucleus accumbens. Preoccupation, thoughts of memories of the deceased person. This probably is connected to the posterior cingulate cortex, because you're thinking about that, and at the same time is the amygdala. The identity disruption connected with the prefrontal cortex. So you see here, like, the behavior is basically the outcome of what is happening neurobiologically as well, because the physical representation in your brain of your loved one is basically trying to adapt, and in some cases it becomes maladaptive. In case of a maladaptive behaviors, we have evidence-based grief interventions. So, for instance, we have here mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, grief-based CBT, the expressive writing and narrative therapy, and group therapy. But we live in times where people are seeking help elsewhere, which brings us to the topic of artificial intelligence. Like, you probably know or heard someone that's using AI as an emotional regulation. But why people use artificial intelligence? Well, first, healthcare is very expensive, which actually makes therapy very expensive. Stigma can isolate people, like we saw the cases of suicide and HIV grief. Social networks might be weakened. That makes the person even more isolated. And people might go online thinking they're like, oh, I'm going to be anonymous here, which in reality, nobody's anonymous online anymore. But this bonding with artificial intelligence happens in 3 phases. Initially, you start using it as a functional tool, like asking questions, researching things online. But the way how AI talks is kind of like a human-like. So it might confuse it initially. And the next phase is like people start opening it up with this AI because it looks like a human. And it validates you, and it also agrees with you in a lot of things that usually in real life you're never going to get someone to agree with you in a lot of things. And that can lead to emotional investment on this interaction with artificial intelligence. There's observing the brain areas like we saw in grief. We see like here there might be some brain areas that also are similar that we saw in grief. So starting with amygdala becomes highly active together with the prefrontal cortex. In this case, is active because you emotionally process what AI is talking to you. The nucleus accumbens and the ventral tegmental area responsible for attachment and reward. That might explain why people get really addicted to AI interactions. And the anterior cingulate cortex and insula are responsible for like what makes you feel like you're talking to a human. Which in this case, AI might confuse you that because the way how it's written, you're talking to a person. This study from MIT, they observed how young people were using AI. And they observed that people have been using those large language models as like almost like emotional regulation. And what they observed after a whole month, that people, after using AI for long periods of time, they start becoming more lonelier. They start having problems with socializing with others. They become emotionally dependent on chatbots, and they start presenting problematic use. But bring it to the context of grief, there's this study that looked at Replica and Project December, which are 2 AIs that actually can create replicas of people that of any other person. So people basically upload information of their loved ones. And what you see here, what people did when they used the grief bots, they used to cope with loneliness, to continue bonds, having a non-judgmental and unbiased listener, and other examples here of their usage. And many of them are like allege that grief bots help them to solve their grievance. But we need to be careful with this study because in general, this study is basically a qualitative study. It's not like a quantitative study. So basically it's not objective. So people were just saying, we're just taking what people are saying, but we don't attest that actually they improve over time. We're just taking for what people are saying. But this leads us to a very concerning point that is like, as we live in a society that people are very isolated, people are using artificial intelligence as the last resort to actually find comfort and empathy, which is something that we should be even thinking about, and not only in grief, not particularly in grief, but we should look this broadly in other instances as well in terms of mental health. But I want to bring to your attention here that all those companies that you see here, none of them follow HIPAA guidelines, okay? So be careful when you're interacting with artificial intelligence in general. And what is, for people who don't know what HIPAA is, basically it tells who has access, who sees, make sure that your personal healthcare information is secure, and tells what kind of professionals have access to this information. But we need to be careful because people are using AI to disclose psychological information, which can lead us to really even think about that they should actually be charged because they're collecting healthcare information. But I just want to bring to your attention that all those gentlemen that you see on the screen, they are protected by the Section 230 of the U.S. Telecommunications Act, which basically takes the responsibility off them and put on the user. Because whatever you do with your AI model is between you and the AI, and the responsibility is yours, not theirs. These two Harvard professors, they did a very interesting comment writing at Nature magazine, and they raised the ethical question that AI models basically can foster extreme emotional attachments and dependencies similar to human relationships, which can lead to ambiguous loss. So ambiguous loss in this case is anytime the AI has a different update, it might change a little bit. People feel like the AI is a little off, and they might grieve the model that they build emotional connection. And also people can become emotionally dependent on AI, something that we saw on the study conducted by MIT, which is something that we should be really thinking about when people are using AI. Another ethical concern is the commercialization of memory and distortions of loved ones. So basically those companies, they sell you a product that you can continue a memory of someone, but at the same time distorting that possibility that you continue talking to your loved one, even though they're not here physically anymore. That brings a lot ethical concern that if that is actually that could be potentially harmful to someone. To finish this presentation, I want to give you the quote from Yuval Noah Harari, that is from his book Nexus, that says computers could form intimate relationships with people and use the power of intimacy to influence us. To foster such fake intimacy, computers will not need to develop any feelings of their own. They just need to learn to make us feel emotionally attached to them. Thank you very much, and these are my references.